Greetings, listeners. We're back with part 5 of the wonderful Ethiopians of the Cushite Empire. Harine continues. Meroe, from time immemorial, had been an oracle of Jupiter. Its soil was extremely fertile. As late as 1000 BC, it was one of the most powerful states of the ancient world. Accounts left us by the ancients have been considered fabulous, but not so to those who have viewed the ruins now covering the site of this once powerful and highly civilized state. Remnants of mighty buildings covered with sculptures, representations of priestly ceremonies and battles, rows of sphinxes and colossi give rise to the question as to which nation, Ethiopia or Egypt, imparted its knowledge to the other. Until historical times, Ethiopia furnished Egypt with gold. Her ravines were worked until the middle of the 12th century. Gold was extracted by crushing, a very costly method, proving that these mines had been very rich and must have been a source of the great profusion of golden articles found in many African ruins and graves. King describes the Fayum district, which grew in great profusion, roses, vine olives, sugar cane, and cotton. Here the orange and lemon trees attained the size of our apple trees. The district was in more primeval times and depression. An early pharaoh cut a deep channel through the rocky barrier toward the Nile and let in the western river. Since the 12th dynasty, this lake had been one of blessing and abundance. This tract, thus reclaimed from the desert, was justly a wonder of Egypt. Here the marvelous Lake Moeris received the discharge of the Bahr Yusuf, which was 1/2 the volume of the Nile. It was one of the astounding engineering feats of the old world and still ranks as one of the most marvelous achievements of mankind. Notwithstanding the drying up of Lake Moeris, the Fayum is still an important and fertile province. Gold appears in the Elba Hills. Topaz mines are worked, while perhaps its emerald mines were then the oldest and most extensive in the world, and the only ones known until the conquest of Peru. Ethiopia seems to have had an inexhaustible supply of building material of the first quality. Sandstone, limestone, and granite were worked there for ages. In ancient days, the buildings seem to have been of red brick. Now the people live in mud huts. Barth speaks of the numerous ruins of Upper Nubia, which attest the splendor of the ancient cities. The average student doesn't know that in Nubia are infinitely more monuments and temples than in Egypt. Besides this, Arabs say that Europeans are acquainted with few of the monuments concealed by the encroaching sands in the desert. 12 miles north of Naga is a labyrinth of ruined buildings. The Arabs call it Maserat. The central building is one of the largest known edifices, being 2,700 feet in circumference. Its columns are fluted but without hieroglyphics. The Earth and Its Inhabitants, Recluse, Volume 1, page 246. 6. The two temples of Jebel Arden are covered with sculpture representing the victories of a king who bears the titles of one of the Egyptian pharaohs. One of the buildings is approached by an avenue of sphinxes. The pyramids, temples, colonnades, avenues of animals and statues are still standing at Meroe. Their sandstone was not so durable as that of Egypt. 80 pyramids have been damaged by sightseers. Lepidus, with difficulty, prevented the systematic destruction of the mountains, of the monuments of Meroe. Cairo was built by removing the marble facing of the Great Pyramid. Thus have many ancient ruins disappeared. The pyramids of Meroe do not compare with those of Egypt in magnitude, though they are more artistic. Reclus describes the two temples at Abu Simbel that take their place as marvels of ancient art. They are the monuments of Ibsambul. The southern temple is hewn out of the living rock. Before the gate sit 4 colossi over 60 feet high, of noble and placid countenance. All these colossi are covered with inscriptions. In the interior of the rock follow 3 large halls in succession and 12 smaller ones whose walls contain brilliant paintings. If you will examine the faces of these colossi in any book of authentic cuts, you will find that they are the faces of full-featured Ethiopians. Quote, many temples succeed these as far as the first cataract, containing burial grottos, gateways, and towers. Almost buried in the sand, travelers find the ancient town of Mabindi, whose tunnel-shaped galleries, like those of Crete, are still to be seen passing under the houses. We see Dakar with its gigantic gateways, only possible of erection by the hand of the ancient Cushite. In the sepulchral cave, Beit El Wali, are sculptures representing triumphal processions, assaults, court, and battle scenes. These have been rendered more popular by engravings than any other. The colors of these paintings are still remarkably brilliant. End quote. The Earth and Its Inhabitants, Volume 1, page 306. The temples of Debod and Dakar were built by the Ethiopian king Ergamenes. Many of these ruins and this art appear to us as Egyptian, but as Sayce points out, the little temple of Amada in Nubia, built by Thutmose III in honor of his young wife, and delicately finished and brilliantly painted sculpture on stone, is worth far more than the colossal monuments of Ramses II. Ramses cared more for size and number of buildings than for their careful construction and artistic finish. Sayce describes the building of his era as mostly scamper, the walls ill-built, and the sculpture coarse and tasteless. Even here in Nubia, the monument of Abu Simbel forms a striking contrast. Wrought by the hands of Nubians, it forms one of the world's wonders, carved in rock. It is, as Sayce says, the noblest monument left us by the barren wars and vain glorious monuments of Ramses Sesostris, ancient empires of the East. A.H. Sayce. Meroe had an army of 250,000 trained men and 400,000 artisans when her rule reached Syria. One noteworthy feature was the enormous size of the city of Meroe. It covered an almost unbelievable area, The ruins that Pliny described had disappeared in Roman times, so ancient was their origin. That is why so little can be learned about Ethiopia by the study of the country today. The period of her ancient glory was too far beyond the ages of our times. Hoskins thought the pyramids of Giza magnificent and wonderful in effect and artistic design. There were pyramids used for burial places at the site of Meroe. On the reliefs of the walls of the burial chambers, the rulers appear purely Cushite. Callion thought Maserat a unique place having no parallel in Egypt to have been a great college. Hirin thought it the site of the oracle of Jupiter, at whose command colonies issued forth, which carried civilization, arts and religion from Ethiopia into the Delta, to Greece and to far Nordic lands. The Encyclopedia Britannica says, the Nubians are supposed by some authorities to agree with the ancient Egyptians more closely than the Copts, usually deemed their representatives, end quote. According to Dr. Pritchard, it is probable that the Barabra may be an offshoot from the original stock that first peopled Egypt and Nubia. It was the old race of the higher civilization that ruled Egypt in the pre-dynastic ages. It was from this nation went forth the colonies that spread civilization. This old race of the Upper Nile, the Agu or Anu of the ancient traditions, spread their arts from Egypt to the Aegean, from Sicily to Italy and Spain. Mosso Angelo says that the characteristic decorations on the pottery of the Mediterranean race of prehistoric times is identical with that of pre-dynastic Egypt. Reisner in 1899 examined 1,200 tombs in the Nile Valley. He found the remains of a distinct race who buried their dead with legs doubled up against abdomen and thorax. This was an old Ethiopian form of burial, which preceded embalming and may be traced through ancient Cushite lands. Earnest and conscientious students seeking the facts about ancient Ethiopia find but scanty and unsatisfactory references in modern books. Going back to ancient records, we find voluminous testimony. Out of this material, the modern author selects what he sees fit and rejects much authentic history about Ethiopia. One book would tell us that the Ethiopians belonged to the Japhetic stock. In fact, this is the favored theory, yet the encyclopedia says that Nubians are a Negroid stock. Others say that they are Semitic. There is a world of contradiction in modern books from an ethnological standpoint. Without the untangling of these threads, one must have a narrow and twisted conception of true history. In ancient days, the African nations were proud and mighty. Cambyses marched against the Egyptians because their king had refused him a daughter in marriage. A stele in the British Museum shows how the fleet of Cambyses was destroyed by the Ethiopians on the Nile, and the land forces succumbed to famine. At this time, the temples of Napata were already in ruins. Pyramids were erected for a long line of queens called Candace. The high treasure of one of these queens was converted to Christianity under the preaching of Philip. To prove how lasting is the religious impression upon the heart of the Ethiopian, Abyssinia is the only great Christian nation of any importance in the East today. The Candace queens ruled over an Ethiopia that included Abyssinia, but their center was near Meroe, where they were buried. The scriptures spoke of the treasure of Queen Candace, accumulated from the merchandise and wealth of Ethiopia. Strabo spoke of a queen warrior of Ethiopia. This line of queens was of a race type never seen among Egyptians. They had the pronounced Bushman figure. The renowned Queen of Sheba, Queen of the South, who visited Solomon, belonged to this line of queens. Ethiopia furnished the perfumes of the ancient world. From Meroe to Memphis, the most common object carved or painted in the interior of the temples was the censer and the bands of the priests. They worshipped the presiding deity with gold and silver vessels, rich vestments, gems, and many other offerings. Various substances were used for incense, but the most esteemed came from Ethiopia. It was from these costly products that this nation derived much of its wealth that has seemed fabulous to the thoughtless. For the embalming of the dead, spicery in vast quantities was used. The Hindus and Egyptians use incense to this day. The Hebrews burned incense. Nineveh, Persepolis, the earthenware of China, all show innumerable forms of censers. Greece, Rome, and on down to our day in Catholic ceremonies, we find that the incense, first necessary to allay the odors of animal sacrifice, and finally taking its place, still persists. In ancient days, when the dead were buried in churches, the burning of incense was thought necessary to preserve men's health. For these reasons, we must recognize how enormous must have been the traffic to supply such demands. Early writers said that Ethiopians had fountains with the odor of violets, and that her prisoners were fettered with gold chains. Considering the natural products of Ethiopia, her commerce, the strength of her armies, spoken of by the scriptures as 1,000,000, we find them a substantial foundation for ancient traditions about that nation. Another remarkable people of these regions were the Microbians. Herodotus describes the visit of the ambassadors of Cambyses to them. He directed his expedition against them because of their reputed wealth. His spies brought presents to this king of the Ethiopians. They were a very tall race, and the king was chosen for his great stature. They were a civilized people with their own laws and institutions. The spies brought a purple robe, gold and perfumes, and a cask of palm wine. This king looked at their presents and despised them. He inquired how long they lived and what they ate. When told that they lived 80 years, he said, "I do not wonder that you who feed upon such rubbish should live no longer. The Microbians," he said, "lived 120 years and sometimes longer, their chief food being flesh and milk." This diet was evidence of civilization. He sent a message to the Persian king that filled him with rage. "When you can bend the bow which I send you, then you may undertake an expedition to the Microbians." Now we end tonight's readings. May you sleep in peace, and may you awake in greater peace. Until next time, good night.